in the last 3 to 4 classes, we were mainly discussing about the mechanisms of resistance, how insects gain resistance to insecticides. In today's class, we will study how this resistance can be detected and why we are going for detection of resistance. What are the practical applications of resistance? And mainly, one more thing we will study with respect to that is resistance monitoring. That is part of resistance detection only. But if you continuously go for screening of insects for insecticide resistance, then it is called as monitoring. So let's see all those things with respect to detection and monitoring of insecticide resistance. I will share. So that's methods of detection. First, we will see what are the practical applications of resistance detection and monitoring. And yesterday, I told you about a scientist named Dr. Kranti from CACL Nagpur, and I also told you about his one of his work with respect to Helicobacter. So he monitored insecticide resistance in Helicobacter in different seasons at different geographical location. In Kharif, it will be invariably in cotton. In Rabi, it will be in chickpea, and summer it will be in vegetables. So whether the resistance varies temporarily, that is over time. He also monitored the resistance level even in a single crop, say in cotton. Say after 2 months, 3 months after planting, 4 months after planting, 5 months after planting, he collected the larvae and he monitored the level of insecticide resistance. So that is temporal variability over time, whether there is any change in the susceptibility of the insect or to an insecticide. Geographic variability, say if you take in one at least I think a few classes before I told you about we collected Tribolium castaneum from different locations of Kerala, different FCA godowns of Kerala, and checked for susceptibility to insecticides. That is to assess geographic variability, whether Tribolium collected populations collected from different locations varies in its susceptibility to insecticide or not. Helicopter Amidara collected from different locations of Maharashtra, Karnataka, Andhra, whether it varies. And now your senior, I'm forgetting the student's name because he misses students for a long time. I think Anju. Yes, Anju is Smita Madam's student. She is working on loose nodus, and she is trying to assess the susceptibility of loose nodus to diamides, flubendiamide and chlorantraniliprole in Karnataka, Andhra, Tamil Nadu, and Kerala. So what we intend to study is whether there is any change in this susceptibility in different geographies. So that is resistance monitoring. One of the major application is to detect and document whether there is any variability geographically and temporally. Temporally, that means over a period of time, whether there is any change in resistance. And this resistance monitoring is nothing but we continuously, routinely collect the insects. We'll check the level of resistance, whether it is increasing, decreasing, is not or not. So that is resistance monitoring. And once we are introducing a new pesticide, so if you are continuously going for a resistance monitoring program, a new insecticide with a novel mode of action is introduced, go for continuous monitoring. This continuous monitoring will help us to detect whether there is any change in the frequency of resistance genotype. That means if the number of individuals with resistance gene is increasing or not. If the number of individuals with resistance gene is increasing, it indicates what? What it can indicate. If the number of genes with resistant genotypes increases, It indicates
Getting resistant towards the compound.
yes. So that will enable modern pesticide, especially multinational companies, DuPont and all. Now it's acquired by FMC. They usually carry out this kind of programs because if the insect develops resistance to an insecticide pretty quickly, a new insecticide resistance quickly, farmers will stop using that pesticide at all, and they will lose huge sum because they have a short window of 10 to 15 years for a pesticide. Within that period they have to recover all the uh, expenditure they have incurred for discovering the molecule, registering it, marketing it and all. So if the insect becomes resistant within that short period, it's gone. Say, I will take the example of flubendiamide. In India, it was introduced in 2007 or 8. And now, if you see flubendiamide efficacy is pretty low. I usually don't recommend flubendiamide in rice now. For the last 4 to 5 years, I switched over to chlorantraniliprole because flubendiamide is not that effective. So the company, actually it's a product from Bayer. Bayer suffers if a product is unable to give enough protection, farmers will abandon that the use of that particular pesticide. So actually, the lifespan for flubendiamide in the market, effective lifespan for the flubendiamide in the Indian market was hardly less than 10 years. It will be 7 or 8 years. So what they did was they licensed flubendiamide to other companies also because they don't have much value now. So we help us to monitor. If we have carry out a resistance monitoring program, then it will help us to detect whether there is any change in resistance frequency or not. And another application is to assess whether the pesticides are effective or not. Say one insect has developed resistance. Now we have to recommend another insecticide for managing it, which still has some efficacy against it. Then we have to carry out biosay. We have to find out whether alternate pesticides which we are recommending are effective or not. So here, resistance monitoring also involves conducting bioassays to detect relative efficacy of other insects. Say in our experiment also, in Anusari's work, we malathion, dichlorvos, and deltamethrin are the recommended pesticides. They have been continuously used. We assessed an alternate pesticide, chlorphenapyr, to check its efficacy. It was extremely effective. So here also we can go for, that's an application of bioassay also. Resistance detection and monitoring also involves checking the relative efficacy of insecticide. So even with this, I will take it in another way also. Say malathion, dichlorvos, and deltamethrin we checked. Among these three, malathion has lost its efficacy, it's resistant. Dichlorvos slowly losing its efficacy, but deltamethrin is still effective. Tribulin has not evolved any resistance to deltamethrin. So we can go for recommending deltamethrin. So that will help us to help in continuous, this data we can get only if we are going for resistance monitoring program. And another thing is that if we continuously go for a resistance monitoring, if one insecticide has lost its efficacy, we can discontinue its use. That means we can advise farmers not to use that pesticide because that pesticide has lost its effectiveness. You have to shift to a more effective molecule, which we have found out that you can recommend a effective pesticide. So we can avoid ineffective molecule. And if you detect any during the monitoring program, if you detect any change in the resistance frequency, then we can warn the farmers, stop excessive use of this particular pesticide, choose another pesticide with different mode of action which is effective so that resistance development can be prevented. We can warn the farmers pretty early if we detect a change in the genotype frequency, resistance genotype frequency. And another application is if some farmers come to you and claim that there is a failure of particular pesticide. and they argue that that's because of resistance to an insecticide. Then conduct a resistance monitoring program, check whether the failure of that pesticide is really due to insecticide resistance or not. So it will help us to confirm whether the failure of a particular pesticide to manage insect is due to resistance or not. And at the last application, in say we have a situation where insect has evolved resistance. Take the case of cotton. Helicobacter armiger has evolved resistance. Then we have implemented a resistance management program in that particular area where farmers were using pesticides excessively. We implemented a resistance management program, and during the implementation, monitor the resistance level in Helicobacter armigera. So if the management program is working, then we can see a reduction in the resistance level. So these are the different applications of resistance detection and monitoring. First, to check the variability geographically, the variability of resistance geographically and temporally. And second one is to detect any change in the resistance genotype so that we can easily warn the farmers that there is a change in insecticide resistance. You have to adopt the use of other insecticides with different mode of action. Then which can check the efficacy of molecules which we are recommending. If some pesticide is lost its efficacy, we can avoid those ineffective molecule. Then we can confirm whether the failure to control a pest is due to insecticide resistance or not, and we can evaluate the effectiveness of a resistant management program. So these are the reasons why we go for a resistance detection and monitoring program. So in a monitoring program, usually what are all the objectives? I told you why we are going for resistance monitoring and detection. And usually what is the objectives we set for a resistance monitoring program? The first one is baseline data collection. That means if you are introducing a pesticide for the first time, then if you have to say that the insect has after say 5 years, say in 2021, one company has introduced a particular pesticide molecule, and in 2025, one set of farmers argued that that pesticide has lost effectiveness, and that's because of the loss of that's because of the development of resistance. Then you have to check the carry out a bioassay, check the LC50, and we'll have to compare with the susceptibility of the insect in 2021. In 2021, what was the susceptibility level of insect to that particular insecticide? In 2025, what is the level of susceptibility? Whether insecticide has lost its toxicity, whether the insect has evolved resistance over time. If we have to say that, then we should have a baseline data. That means a data in 2021 itself. That is baseline data. So whenever a pesticide is introduced, you should have a baseline data. Sometimes what we do is we normally in baseline data cannot be generated all over the country. Say in Kerala, Tamil Nadu, if all the states, if a pesticide is introduced from different locations, generating baseline data is a bit difficult. So what we usually do is we will have a baseline data from a susceptible population which we maintain in the land. In the same, that's why in tribolium, I don't have a baseline data because tribolium is a pest which is present in storage for very long time, and nobody has conducted a baseline data before, so we don't have any references. Someone has done at least 30 or 40 years before. We could have compared 40 years before the LC50 was this much, and now in 2019 the LC50 is now this much. Insect has evolved resistance. So we don't have the kind of data. That baseline data we don't have. So what we usually do is we take a susceptible strain of insect with that insect which is not at all exposed to a pesticide for a very long time, and compare this LC50 of susceptible and resistant individuals. So baseline data, ideally, we should take it from a field population at the time of introduction of a particular pesticide, because at that time susceptibility of the insect will be extremely high. Later on, with the continuous use, slowly insect will develop resistance. So this is baseline data collection. Second one is monitoring the susceptibility over time. So that is a monitoring program that we have discussed. Once the pesticide 2021 we are introducing, every year we collect some insects from the field, carry out resistance monitoring program, and to check whether the insect is gaining resistance to insecticide or not. And this monitoring program will help us to detect resistance. If we continuously monitor it, we can detect whether the insect is developing resistance or not. Is it fine with the objectives of resistance? Are you clear with baseline data collection? Because that's the term which I introduced for the first time. Yes or no?
Sir,
Yes.
സസെപ്റ്റിബിലിറ്റി ചെക്ക് ചെയ്യാനേ ലാബിലാ ചെയ്യുന്നെന്ന് പറഞ്ഞല്ലോ. അപ്പോൾ അത് എങ്ങനെയാണ് നമുക്ക് ഒരു ഡാറ്റ കംപ്ലീറ്റ് ലാസ്റ്റ് ഇയേഴ്സിൽ എന്താ ഉണ്ടായി, അതിന്റെ മുന്നേ എന്താ ഉണ്ടായി എന്നൊക്കെ എങ്ങനെയാ മനസ്സിലാവുക? ജസ്റ്റ് ലാബിലാണല്ലോ.
Only if we are going for a continuous monitoring, then only we can tell how the insect changes its susceptibility over a period of time. We can't say with simply by saying this year you are conducting biopsy in the lab, and we can't say that last year what was the susceptibility. We can't say that. If you have a continuous monitoring program, Dr. Kranti had a continuous monitoring program. For years together, he monitored resistance in Helicobacter. That's how he told temporarily that means over a period of time there was a change in the susceptibility. Understood?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And one more technique is there. Instead of going into lab, that I will say in the coming slides, I will say there is no always there is no need for going for a lab study. There are other techniques also that I will tell you later. So coming to resistance detection methods, the first and foremost one, the most widely used one is conventional biopsy. We go for biopsy. What are the different kinds of biopsy you have studied? Anyone? That might have been taught to you during PG. Yes. Anyone?
Sandwiching method like that.
Sandwich method, actually it's not a typical biopsy method. Sandwich method, actually it's mainly meant for BT, isn't it?
Leaf dip method.
Leaf dip method, yes. That's one. Then
Porter tower.
Potter's tower is usually
Direct.
direct spray method, topical direct spray method, topical application, injection method, diet feeding biopsy. We'll mix the pesticide with the diet and feed it. So there are several methods of biopsy. So whatever it may be, but if you are going for a resistance monitoring program, the method should be fixed early itself. That same method will be followed, should be followed. So in tribodium and all, we usually go for residual film biopsy or topical direct spray method. So that's the usual method which we practice. And sometimes insecticide resistance action committee prescribes a particular method for a particular pesticide, particular biopsy method. So that's one. In the case of BT, the usually recommended one is diet feeding biopsy. We'll mix BT with diet and feed the insect. That's the one which we usually do. The helicorp and all, we can mix it with artificial diet. So that's what we normally go for. Then next one is genetic methods. We will discuss what is a genetic method to detect whether the resistance is monogenic, polygenic. That means whether it is determined by a single gene, more than one gene, or if it is dominant, recessive, etc. So those kind of studies can be carried out. And then biochemical assays that we normally do in our lab. Many of our students are working with it. They will detect the level of esterase, will detect the level of glutathione transferase, will detect the level of mixed function oxidase, etc. Then comes molecular assays. That's what we discussed with yesterday with Manisa's student from biotechnology. Uh, Actually, he is going for metagenomics. Otherwise, what we can go for is whether there is any point mutation. Say we are discussed about several point mutations which is leading to insecticide resistance. So we'll try to detect whether the insect has evolved any resistance due to point mutations. Then we have to go for molecular assays. Then immunological assays, that is mainly using ELISA, enzyme linked immunosorbent assay. So we will see it one by one. Conventional bioassay, I'm not going into the techniques of bioassay and all because that you should refer your PG notes. In conventional bioassay, we usually carry out log dose probit assays. That means we go for probit analysis. The second one is that you may or may not have you heard about diagnostic dose or discriminating dose? Yes or no?
No,
No,
sir.
sir.
Okay, that we will be discussing. Log dose probitosis, I will just quickly go through it because that is pretty easy. You might have studied also. Then larval or adult feeding disruption test, that is not widely used. Field dose assay is also not widely used. But log dose probitosis is the most commonly used one. Diagnostic or discriminating dose assay is also used. Still, it is a very common technique adopted if you want to go for large scale screening of resistance. The third and fourth one, feeding disruption and field dose, it's not that common. I haven't seen many papers in those last two techniques. So the first one is what we will do is just like what we have done in our lab for tribolium. We have a population from IRA which is susceptible. We have a population collected from different locations. We calculate the LC50 by biopsy and probit analysis. We have LC50 of field collected population and LC50 of the susceptible strain. We divide the LC50 of field collected strain divided by the susceptible strain. If the value and that value we get is called as resistance factor. I studied about this resistance factor or resistance ratio. Resistance factor or resistance ratio, yes or no?
No, sir.
Yeah? Yes or no? I couldn't hear you properly.
No, sir.
No. So this is the resistance factor. We will just calculate the LC50 of susceptible strain as well as LC50 of resistance strain or field strain. We will divide the LC50 of actually resistance ratio is the ratio of LC50 of field collected population to LC50 of susceptible population. And if the resistance factor is greater than 1, then what does it indicate? After seeing the equation, if the resistance ratio or resistance factor is greater than 1, what does this indicate?
LC50 of field collected strain is more
More than
than this acceptable.
then if the LC50 of field collected population is more, then
Less resistant.
less resistant.
More
More,
more
more
resistant.
resistant. More
More,
resistant.
it is gaining resistance. It is gaining resistance. That means it is become. Usually we say that it is losing its susceptibility to insecticide. It is becoming less and less susceptible to insecticide. So that's all the common term which we use. Because a slight increase in resistance ratio may not indicate that insect has evolved resistance. say in the last point I have mentioned, see, if the resistance ratio is less than 10, we usually say it is can be due to tolerance, it may not be due to paka resistance. If it is only more, if it is more than 10, then only we usually say it is resistance. I will discuss with another thing. Yeah, this is the data from our study where we did it with tribolium. Take the case of LC50 of susceptible one. See this. That is LC50. It's in ppm. Unit is ppm. 520.76. Take the case of Angamali population. That is the population collected from Angamali. The LC50 is 6949.8. Can you say the resistance ratio? And someone quickly calculate and tell the resistance ratio. Anyone?
13.3.
Yes? Yes, louder.
13.3.
Ah, yes, 13.3. So that indicates that Ankamali population, Ankamali strain of IARA, of Tribolian Castanium, is 13-fold more tolerant to malathion than the IRA strain. That means if you are using 1 ppm of insecticide for managing IRA strain, for Angamali, if you have for Angamali population, you have to use 13 ppm. Then only 50% of the population will get killed. And imagine there are instances where insects evolve resistance 500 times, 600 times, 700 times, 900 times, etc. Then you can imagine what is the level of resistance in that insect. That means if you are using 1 ppm for managing susceptible population, you have to use 900 ppm for resistant population. And one more thing, I don't know whether have you studied about fiducial limits and all during LC50 calculation and all?
No, sir.
Fiducial, if I had to discuss about fiducial limit, I had to discuss about probit analysis. I will leave it for some time. If we get time, I will discuss about probit analysis later. Then only this is how we usually compare. See, one simple thing I will tell you about fiducial limit is here. See, this is the. Have you heard about standard error of mean? In papers, we usually say that we usually give standard error of mean. So if you give a value, after that value, we usually say plus or minus this much. That is, we usually say it as standard error of mean. Have you seen that?
Yes, sir.
Yes, this is the same thing. That means if we are giving, say, we have given 5% error. See, usually in statistical analysis, we can give either 5% or 1% error. That means 95% probability or 99% probability. So this is all 95% probability. That is the thing which. So this fiducial limit indicates that the LC50 value of IARI can vary between 434.2 and 613.1. We have got an LC50 of this much. So next time on another day, I am doing the same bioassay with IRS strain again with malathion. Then I may not get at the same value 520.76. I may not get, but that time also the LC50 value will lie between 434.2 and 613.1. So that is the range within which the LC50 of Tribolian Castanian to Malathion lies for this particular strain of Tribolian. Understood?
Yes, sir.
Yes. So the same manner, this is for other populations. Compare this. So there is no overlapping over the susceptible for this 430, 4.2 and 630. This is the highest value. Nowhere this Molagunatavu, Veliyatura, Tikkodi, Olavakod and Angamali. These populations are not at all coming in close range to this IRA population, fiduciary limit of IRA. But see the case of this resistant population. All of them, the fiduciary limit values overlap between each other. Yes or no? All
Yes.
of them have, yes. That means the populations, FCA populations, which we have collected from different locations of Kerala, doesn't vary significantly among each other, among this population. They vary significantly from the IRA population, the susceptible population. But Mudamunatavu, Veliyadura, Tikkodi, and Alovakod and Langamali, which we collected from different locations of Kerala, though they have evolved resistance. The LC50, if you say that, say, Mudamunatavu LC50 is 6,157, Angamali it is 6,949, and say Tikkod it is 5,703. And just seeing the values, you may say that Tikkodi is more susceptible and Angamali is more resistant. But compare the fiduciary limit value, both are overlapping. That means that the Tikkodi and Angamali population, though their LCFT values may be different, but their fiduciary limits are overlapping. So that means that they are not significantly different from each other. Understood? Just like our CD value, you may have been comparing, isn't it?
Yes, sir. Sir, Angamali fiduciary limit 10,000 വരെ എത്തുന്നില്ലേ?
Yes.
അപ്പോ ഓവർലാപ്പിംഗ് അതിനകത്ത് തന്നെ വരുന്നുണ്ട് എന്നുള്ളതുകൊണ്ടാണോ തിക്കോടി
Yes.
ആൻഡ് അങ്കമാലി?
Yes. 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 Even though the Angamali, the range is a bit broad because maybe a bit of error may be there. I think the chi-square value is still okay, fine. Chi-square is the goodness of fit of that regression line. If the chi-square value is low, then our bias is good. That's what it says. I'm not going into deep because then I have to explain more and more about the bit analysis. So chi-square means the goodness of it. It should be below at certain level of degrees of freedom. It should be below certain point. So the chi-square value is good. That means, say, why this fiduciary limit can be a bit broad. Say, if the population is highly heterozygous, that means some individuals are homozygous, some individuals are heterozygous. So there is some kind of inherent difference among the population. Then we may get the bioside data, slightly complicated bioside data, then the fiduciary limit will be a bit high. That means that there is some heterozygosity present in that particular population. That's what a broad range of fiduciary limits is. Ideally, we should have a very close range of fiduciary limit. That indicates that that population is extremely homozygous. Take the case of IRA strain. It's very narrow range. So that means that IRA population, that because we have maintained it in the lab over several years, over decades together. So it's as it is homozygous only. So that's why we got a very narrow range. In the field, anyway, we can't get homozygosity. It breeds with several kind individuals, so heterozygosity will be prevalent. So you have a slightly broad fiduciary limit. So that's what we normally get in the field. Lab strains, susceptible strains, fiduciary limits will be extremely narrow. Then comes diagnostic dose or discriminating dose biopsy. So I told you in the previous.
So,
Yes, Bindu.
so we are comparing the susceptible insect of lab or field.
Lab susceptible from IRA. Actually, we maintained it in the lab only.
Okay.
because we don't have a if we collect it from field, we can't say it as susceptible. If say I will take another example. Say you collected, instead of IRA, you collected it from an FCA godown in Delhi. Leave IRA, Delhi, and we got the same LC50 value. Then we can say that this population from Delhi, the tripolline Castellanian population from Delhi, is most susceptible to malathion compared to populations from Kerala. That we can say. So sometimes what we will do is, if we have a population, if we compare different populations, and if we don't have any susceptible strain maintained in lab, we compare with different populations, and if one population is extremely susceptible, very low LC50 value, we'll take that as the reference sample. Understood? In the previous in resistance ratio, I told that it should be the ratio is LC50 of field collected population by LC50 of susceptible strain. Here it is a lab rate strain. Say I don't have a lab rate susceptible strain. Then what we will do is, say we have collected 10 population, and among these 10, whichever one has the lowest LC50 value, that we will take as the susceptible one, and we will take it as the denominator. Understood?
Okay. Yes, sir.
Because in certain cases we don't have susceptible populations maintained in the lab. For storage and or maintenance is easy. Other insects is bit difficult. Coming to discriminating dose bioassay. Discriminating dose bioassay is a quick way of resistance monitoring. Easy way of resistance monitoring. In normal bioassay, the conventional bioassay method, which we have discussed just before, we collect the insect, we'll rear it in the lab. Rearing, it's a cumbersome process. Storage, it's a bit easy, but take the case of Helicobacter, you had to rear the larvae individually. For each dose, 25-30 insects. Sometimes it may be possible for aphids and all, we may have to take 100 insects per dose. It should be replicated. So it's extremely time consuming, it's extremely laborious, it's extremely expensive also. So scientists have come up with a technique called as diagnostic or discriminating dose bioassay. So what we will do is, we have a susceptible population, we carry out a bioassay, and we have LC50, LC90 and LC99 values. Okay. Take the LC99 value. Sometimes in some cases we take LC90 also. We won't take LC50 value. Either we take LC90 or LC99 value. Any value, LC value, is a concentration value above 90. Usually it is LC99 or LC90 of the susceptible population. And we will collect insect from the field, and we will carry out bioassay of that population just collected from the field, and the dose we will take only a single dose, that is LC90 or LC99, and we will carry out the bioassay. I will say how it was done by Dr. Kranti. So what he did was, he fixed the diagnosed discriminating dose for Helicobacter majora. So we have already in susceptible population, he collected the susceptible population from University of Reading in UK. So he had that Reading population which is susceptible. So after carrying out bioassay for each insecticide, he has the LC90 or LC99 value, which he took it as discriminating dose. So the bioassay method he followed was dipping method, larval dip. Dip the larvae in the pesticide solution for a particular period of time, take it out and see the mortality. So what we can do is take a vial containing that particular dose, that LC90 or LC99 value, which we have fixed that diagnostic dose. We'll take a vial. In the vial, we will have that diagnostic dose of pesticide already mixed. In the field, collect the larvae, dip it, keep it for a particular period which we have already fixed, say 5 seconds or 10 seconds, take it out, observe after 1 hour. If the larvae is dead, then we can say that that larvae is susceptible. If the larvae remains alive, then we can say that the larvae is resistant. Understood?
Yes, yes.
Yes. That's the way diagnosis. So it's a quick way, easy way. Though I've just simplified it, it has certain parameters has to be maintained, because if you are using, if you're going for larval dip helicoverpa, if you're going for larval dipping of first instar larvae of helicoverpa in one vial, and in the another field the person got third instar larvae, in another field he got fifth instar larvae, we won't be able to compare this. Whatever it may be, it should be a uniform stage, particular instar. If a person is working in a particular instar on a particular instar, say, if you ask me, if you show me a Spodoptera litura larvae and ask me to identify which instar is, I will easily identify, because in PhD I worked with Spodoptera. I can easily identify the instar. So if we fix it as third instar larvae of, we have to go for discriminating dose biopsy with third instar larvae of Spodoptera. Then we will take only third instar larvae. Even if we get first instar, second instar, we will avoid it. We will take only third instar larvae, because stage is extremely important. The value will change, susceptibility will change over time. So this is a way to detect whether the susceptibility of population of has changed. We'll fix a single dose. That's what the second point says. A single dose is set at the dose which differentiates homozygous resistant individuals from homozygous susceptible and heterozygous resistant individuals. Just imagine that if you are using LC99 as a dose as the discriminating dose. If an insect survives, that indicates that individual is having homozygous resistant gene. Only those individuals with homozygous resistant individuals will survive at that high concentration of LC99. And all those individuals with homozygous susceptible or heterozygous, that means RS population, RS gene, will get killed at that particular dose. So we will be able to differentiate the the homozygous resistant individuals from the other individuals with different genetic makeup. Usually we take LC99. Sometimes in some literature they take LC90 also. And say in a population, say if you have gone to a particular locality, you conducted about 100 diagnostic dose biopsy, and if the mortality is less than 80%, that means among the 100 larvae which you have conducted diagnostic dose biopsy, only 60 got killed, or 70 got killed, or 79 got killed, then we can say that that population has evolved resistance. So that's what normally we say. We won't say it with a single larvae. Single larvae, it's not good. Anyway, we go for any experiment, we have to go for replication. So in diagnostic dose, we conduct a pretty large number of biopsy. So we'll take 30, 40, 50 larvae and carry out. And it's not a fixed one, because in the field we can't fix that number of larvae. In a field we may get 20, in another field we may get 100, in another field we may get 40. We calculate the percentage mortality. If the mortality is less than 80, that indicates that the insect has evolved resistance. 100% mortality means no resistance. Okay. So, but one problem, disadvantage with discriminating dose bias is that only we can say that the population has evolved resistance. If you ask me what is the level of resistance, I don't know. Only we can say is that yes, the insect has evolved resistance. So this method is only a preliminary thing, whether whether the population has evolved resistance or not, yes or no. How much we can't say. Qualitatively we can say yes or no, resistance evolved or no, yes or no. How much resistance? No, we can't say with that. So this is mainly useful if the resistance is due to a dominant gene. The resistance gene is dominant, then only diagnostic dose bias works effectively. If it is polygenic resistance, if it is recessive gene and all, then it may not work easily. Just a minute. Bila. So if we have polygenic resistance and all, then it can be slightly confusing, the data. So but the advantage of diagnostic dose biopsy is we can conduct the biopsy with very less number of insects. Otherwise, for biopsy, we may need huge number of insects. So here with approximately less than 100 individuals, we can carry out the biopsy. And with this kind of bias, if we go for it with smaller number of larvae without much laboratory work, we can detect any change in the frequency of resistant genotype. And it is one of the most practical way of detecting resistance at a pretty early stage itself. Otherwise, it is very cumbersome method, the first conventional biopsy method. And the disadvantage, major disadvantage, I told you, it will not indicate the magnitude of resistance, and it will not be able to identify individuals with different levels of resistance, say moderately tolerant, slightly resistant, moderately resistant, highly resistant. If you want to classify it like that, you can't classify it. So we won't get the magnitude of resistance with discriminating those bias. Coming to the next method, whether discriminating varied among different. Yes, it should be, surely. So I will take one helicoverpa. Why I am taking more example of helicoverpa is in India, helicoverpa is the insect which is widely studied. We have more data with respect to resistance because of the works of Kranti, Dr. Kranti. So he conducted the variability in the mortality at different stages, different larval instars of Spodoptera. So he found out that the first instar larvae of Helicoverpa is extremely susceptible, even if the insect is resistant. Even if the insect is resistant, the first instar larvae is susceptible to insecticide because see LD50, take LD50. What is the unit of LD50?
milligram
Milligram per
kg.
milligram per kg body weight. Now you did you get why and how it does it differs? What is the weight of first instar larvae and what is the weight of fifth instar or the last instar larvae? So we are not differentiating the dose. Even for spraying of a particular pesticide, we are using same dose for first instar larvae and fifth instar larvae. But first instar larvae is having extremely small body weight. So it needs only a pretty little amount of toxicant to kill it. But take the case of final instar larvae. It has a very huge body weight and it has well developed fat bodies. Fat bodies is the point where all the metabolism happen and it will degrade the pesticide. So if we are fixing LC50, then if you are carrying out, if you are fixing a diagnostic dose, sorry, if you are fixing a diagnostic dose, that should be for a particular instar. Because LC50 for first instar will be different, LC50 for second instar will be different, LC50 for third instar will be different, LC50 of adults will be different. Understood? Is
Yes,
it
sir.
clear? Yes. One more bias resistance, this diagnostic dose bias which I have seen is, I don't know who has done it. I read it in a few literature. What they did was, instead of dipping the larvae in insecticide solution, they coated the vial with that particular dose of insecticide. We take a we'll take a vial, we'll pour the insect that particular diagnostic dose of insecticide into it. We'll coat the entire inner surface of that vial with insecticide. We will pour the excess insecticide and we will dry that uh, vial. So the entire inner surface of the vial will be coated with that insecticide. We will close it. We will take that to field, collect the adult, put it in that, or collect the larvae, put it in that. So it will be residual filling method of biopsy. Understood? That also can be done. Adult or larvae, whichever stage, we can do that. In this, in the third method, that is larval or adult fielding disruption, it is pretty simple. What we will do is, we will mix in the diet that particular diagnostic dose of insecticide, and along with the insecticide we will add a dye, a coloring agent, and we will examine the fecal matter, excreta of the insect. If the fecal matter is also colored, then we can say that the insect is excreting the insecticide. Yesterday we have discussed about ATP binding acids, active excretion by ATP binding acids. So we have mixed the dye, a coloring agent, with that insecticide, and we mix the insecticide with the coloring agent into the diet of the insect. We fed that to the larvae. If the larvae excrete the fecal matter with that color, that indicates that it is excreting the insecticide also. So only those individuals which are resistant will be able to excrete those with dyes. Susceptible individuals, the excreta won't be having any dye. Understood?
Yes, sir.
I couldn't see any paper who has done all this method. I just seen it in books only. When it is field dose biopsy, so unlike diagnostic dose biopsy, what discriminating dose biopsy, what we will do is we will take field dose biopsy. Say imidacloprid. Usually we recommend 2.5 ml or 3 ml per 10 liter of water. So we will collect aphid from a field, go for a spray at the field dose, say 2.5 ml or 3 ml per 10 liter, and see the mortality. If there is resistance, a large number of aphids will be live even after the spray of insecticide. So that is field dose biopsy. We try to differentiate the insects, that is resistant and susceptible insects, at the field applied there. That is a field dose. Okay, understood? Fine.
Sir, in order to know what is happening in the field.
Yes. Instead of going for a discriminating dose, we will use the field dose. That means the dose which we normally recommend to the farmers. Okay.
Okay, sir.
The next one is genetic method. I will complete genetic method also. And genetic method, I don't know whether nowadays those kind of studies are very low. Earlier, if you see, several theses have been published to study the genetic mechanism of resistance. So that means, say if you say that I too found out that our lab has found out that tribolium castellanium has evolved resistance to mannithium. And what is the genetic reason for that resistance? What kind of gene is conferring resistance? What is the frequency of resistance? What is the mode of inheritance, whether it is dominant, recessive, etc.? And what is the factors influencing the increase in the resistance alleles frequency over time and space. So basically, it is genetics. So whether it is monogenic or polygenic, whether it is dominant or recessive, what is the frequency of the resistance, what are the factors affecting, say, whether the dose of the insecticide is affecting. So like that, we can carry out these studies using genetic method. I will say how it is calculated. Say this gene can be dominant, recessive, incompletely dominant, or incompletely recessive. That I have discussed to you several times, and it can be monogenic or polygenic. So, if the resistance is monogenic, the degree of dominance, whether it is complete dominance, incomplete recessive, or complete recessive, those parameters we can study by a single equation. What we can do is we calculate the LC54, the susceptible individuals, resistant individuals, and that means homozygous susceptible individuals, homozygous resistant individuals, and heterozygotes. Whether do you have any class at 4 o'clock?
No, sir.
No. Okay. I will complete within 5 minutes. Okay. How we can segregate this? So take all individuals which are surviving above LD90, LC90. What it can be? Is it homozygous susceptible, heterozygous, or homozygous resistant? Those individuals are surviving above LD90 or LC90.
Homozygous resistant.
Yes. Say those individuals which are surviving below those getting surveyed at a concentration between 20 and 80, it will be
Heterozygous resistant.
so. In that manner, we can segregate the population. We take a population, we carry out a different biases. Those surviving, we can take it otherwise. So in that manner, we can separate out susceptible, homozygous susceptible, heterozygotes, and homozygous resistant. We calculate the LC50 for homozygous susceptible, homozygous resistant, and heterozygotes. So X1 is the LD50 value for susceptible homozygotes, X2 is for LC50 value of heterozygotes, and X3 is the LD50 value for persistent zygous individuals. I will repeat: X1 for susceptible homozygous individuals, X2 for heterozygotes, X3 for resistant homozygous. So the degree of dominance, whether that is dominant, recessive, and or, we can calculate by equation D is equal to 2x2 minus x1 minus x3 divided by x1 minus x3. 2x2 minus x1 minus x3 divided by x1 minus x3. If the value of D is equal to 1, then the gene is completely dominant. So, dominant gene. If the value of D lies between 0 to 1, it is incomplete dominance. If the value lies between minus 1 to 0, it is incomplete recessive. If the value is D value of D is minus 1, it is completely recessive. I'm repeating, if it is equal to 1, it is incomplete, it is complete dominance. If it is equal to minus 1, it is completely recessive. If it varies between 0 to 1, incomplete dominance. If it varies from minus 1 to 0, it is incompletely recessive. Understood? We carry out this genetic studies, and we will say that this insect is incompletely dominant, incompletely recessive, or dominant to it has a dominant gene, or it has a recessive gene against this particular insecticide. This is for monogenic resistance. Polygenic, it's not that easy. Not discussing about polygenic over here. Only if the resistance is monogenic, then we can conduct this. Then how we can go for to detect whether it is monogenic or polygenic? How? Go for your UG genetics class. You might have studied about different ratios, 3 is to 1, 1 is to 2 is to 1 or something. F1 generation. Backgrounds. Yes. Here also, that's the same kind of experience we do with insects. We'll have susceptible one, we'll have resistant, we'll go for backcrossing and all, we'll calculate the ratio, and depending upon the ratio, we say whether it is monogenic, polygenic, etc. The same thing. This can be done only with those insects which can be reared in the lab in large numbers, then only we can. So that means every generation we have to carry out biopsy. Okay, is it fine? Shall I stop?
Sir,
Ah,
X1 homozygous susceptible, X2 heterozygous resistant, അങ്ങനെ പറഞ്ഞല്ലോ. And
it is,
D
we can say it as heterozygous only. We can't say it as heterozygous.
heterozygous. Okay. So D values complete dominance എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞിട്ടുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ അത് homozygous resistant അല്ലേ?
Yes.
Okay.
Complete dominance. That means that resistant gene is completely dominant. R. Capital letter R. I will say, see if you discussed about in this in genetics, if it is dominant, we will use capital letters, isn't it?
Yes, sir.
So it will be R. So this one will be small r, smaller. So I don't know how they denote incomplete dominance and incomplete recessive. I am not sure how they depict it. Recessive and dominance, they usually depict it like this.
Maybe capital letters.
Maybe I don't know how. That you might have studied that Gregor Mendel's classical experiments, flower color and all, isn't it? What was the expressions they use? Recessive one, tall and short.
Small.
Tall and. So what they was T, capital letter T for isn't it? This is for dominant one. The recessive one, they will be using it as, isn't it?
Yes, sir.
Yes. Then heterozygous will be capital letter T and small letter T. So again, we usually say about Mendelian genetics is the success of Mendel. I don't know whether the genetics teachers are taught to you. For me, it was taught. They told that usually my teacher told me that the success of Mendel was because of the plant he chose and the characters he chose. In garden pea, the characters, this height is determined monogenically. If it was polygenic, he couldn't have come out with this kind of equations, isn't it?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. All the characters were monogenic.
All the characters were monogenic. I think that might have been taught to you during your UG. So that's why I took a simple example and told you polygenic. Actually, I don't know because in my lab, in IRA, that was storage entomology lab, those scientists, earlier scientists, worked a lot on inheritance, genetics of insecticide resistance. But once I joined my guide and all, because by that time these kind of studies lost its relevance. So most of the time, but still, Dr. Kranti was doing some work with helicorpa. So otherwise, nowadays nobody does it. And I'm not that confident in genetics also. That's why I also don't venture into it. In 70s, 80s, it was a very common problem given to students. Okay. Tomorrow, let me see if I can take. I will tell you tomorrow morning. Okay. If it will be 3 to 4 only. Okay.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you,
Thank
sir.
you.